Hello and welcome to the Green Canary. This week on the show, no, it's not last week's show. It's not the one before that and the one before that, but we will be talking about floods again. This time they're in Victoria. We'll tell you what's going on and why. Now, we're also going to delve this week into one of the most fascinating disputes I've seen in a long, long time. I'm speaking about the netball team, the Diamonds, and their refusal to wear the sponsorship of Gina Rinehart's company. We'll get there in a second. We're also going to talk about the Albanese government's commitment to join Joe Biden's methane pledge. Will we get there? And will it ruin the great Aussie barbecue, as has been threatened by the Nationals? Hint, brackets, don't think so, but we'll have that chat anyway. And look, speaking of hot topics, speaking of debates, speaking of controversies, we're going to talk about lawns, and lawns aren't just that grass out in your backyard or your front yard. They are contested spaces, and we will tell you why on the pod. And I will do all that telling and talking and chatting with my usual co-host. That would be Elfie Scott. Oh, I should say I'm Ant Sharwood, but I'm not as important as Elfie. How are you this week, Elfie?
That's blatantly untrue. Come on. I'm good. Thank you so much, Ant. And you have a little bit of news this week, don't you? Because we're always trying to come up with stories from our week, which can be dreadfully boring when you're both journalists. All we do is sit at our desk.
I drove my children to places. My week was thrilling. Thanks. How was yours? Yeah. No, look, I'm pleased to say I've been longlisted in the book category for the Walkley Awards. That actually technically makes me a finalist.
Amazing. So cool.
Thank you. But I went through all the entries. There's about 30 categories, and I really only counted 3 or 4, depending on your definition, environmental stories. I mean, there's a lot of flood stories in there, but I wasn't counting them. I mean, stories that are actually about an environmental issue. And there's actually a bit of a rumbling that there should be a category environmental media. Best
right.
green news story or scoop or doco or whatever you did of the year. And the Walkleys are absolutely rejigging their categories at the moment, looking towards next year. So get your act together, Walkleys. Don't rely on some bloke like me writing a green-tinged book, hoping to get a nod here and there. Have a whole category and foster and nurture and chase the greatest Australian environmental stories, because, they deserve their own category.
Yes, 100%. I fully back that. But also, again, congratulations on the good news, Ant, because The Brumby Wars is a fantastic book. It's totally deserving of some accolades, and I hope that you end up winning. But either way, I hope you end up getting invited to the awards ceremony and, having a few free wines and a good dinner on them.
It is absolutely all about the free wines. It really is.
That's it, yeah.
Now, this first story that I think we should dive into now is not such a positive story again. It is the floods. I can't believe the state of these Victorian floods. I've just checked the river levels because I'm a nerd and I spend my life checking things like river levels. On the Goulburn River, which starts in the Victorian High Country and it sort of flows north through Shepparton, meeting the Murray just upstream of Echuca. Anyway, the Goulburn River peaked this morning, late last night actually, at 12.06 metres. And the old flood record in 74, when they had the great floods, was 12.09 metres. So we're within 3 centimetres of the biggest recorded flood on the Goulburn River. Wow. It's an absolute disaster zone, and it's so benign looking in Shepparton today, looking at sort of Instagram at all the photos there. Sunny skies there today, and it's going to be 25 degrees and sunny for 3 more days before yet more rain comes, Elfie. So we are looking at a situation where there still are, even though, as I say, blue skies, there are still 60 flood warnings or more than in Victoria that are in place. There are some in southern New South Wales as well, some also in Tasmania. And we're speaking to a flood-affected farmer in Tassie in a few minutes here on the pod. But it's a bloody disaster. It's a different sort of flooding than we get in New South Wales here, Elfie. Ours tend to happen quite quickly after the rain, because a lot of Western Victoria and Northern Victoria is flat. It takes a long time for the water to sort of wind its way down the rivers and get there. So most of this heavy rain was Thursday and Friday, and here we are 3 or 4 or 5 and 6 days later is when a lot of the worst flooding is going to occur.
Yeah.
Anyway, look, again, you just have to say the hand of climate is at play, don't you?
Yes, 100%. And, you know, for all of those people who may be affected by the floods in the days to come, we really hope that you stay safe. And we should remind people that there are also one-off payments going for flood victims across Tasmania and Victoria. So if you have been affected by the floods, I would definitely look into that.
Yeah, well said, well said.
And now let's talk about the next story on our agenda, which is about netball. We haven't spoken about netball before, I don't think. I used to play netball, and that is why, yeah, that's why my ankles are ruined and I can never long distance run again in my life. But that's fine. I'm not complaining.
Were you good, Elfie? Were you a one of those nasty netball play? Did you have white line fever? Like, did you get out there on the court and you went from delightful Elfie to evil Elfie?
Yeah, you bet. I was a very aggressive goal defense. I'm sorry to everybody out there who I may have harassed on the court. Yeah. Anyway, so this week, Australia's national netball team, the Diamonds, have taken a stand against a sponsorship deal from Gina Rinehart's mining giant, Hancock Prospecting. So the deal between Netball Australia and Hancock was actually announced last month. It's worth $15 million, and that is set to continue until the end of 2025. It is a big investment for Netball Australia, considering that they've had huge losses across the past couple of years, but the Diamonds have taken a stand against it. They basically turned up to the opening game of the Constellation Cup. They were supposed to have uniforms that said Hancock Prospecting on them, but the players had obviously opted for an old strip on the uniforms. So there have been environmental concerns cited about having Hancock advertising on the uniforms. And to be fair, when you look back at Gina Rinehart's track record on environmental claims and commentary, fair enough, because I had a little bit of a Google on those news stories recently, and yeah, they're pretty shocking. Like, there have been things in the past where she has said things like students taking action on climate change is, quote, propaganda. She has denied that climate change is caused by man. There are several different instances of her talking to schools and students and saying, do your own research on it.
Because they're better qualified than the atmospheric scientists. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Look, I mean, to be clear, Gina Rinehart is not a coal miner. Iron ore is mostly her game, and so she's not what you might call a climate vandal or a, you know, directly in terms of what she's digging out of the ground, but because of all these things that she has said in the past, and also, look, it's possibly not fair to draw this link, but the netball girls have drawn this link. Her late father, Lang Hancock, said some things that I certainly won't repeat about First Nations Australians, and you know, this was all concerning for the squad, not least because on the current tour there's a player making her debut, Donnell Wallam, and she's an Indigenous player. So look, as former Diamonds captain Shani Norda said, and I quote, we have always stood up for social justice. We have always been anti-gambling, no smoking. And there are other avenues to source sponsorship. So Elfie, I just think this is fascinating because in sport, we've seen Israel Folau virtually kicked out of rugby for his homophobic posts. We saw something in the AFL just last week or the week before with the Essendon CEO appointed, then kicked out 24 hours later because everyone went, whoa, he's got links to this Melbourne church that has made similarly homophobic and other distasteful comments. And he also didn't fare so well in the Banking Royal Commission. They sort of said, how do you employ this bloke at all in the first place? So we have seen figureheads, sponsorships, all sorts of things kicked out of sport for ethical reasons, but not, as far as I can recall, for environmental reasons. So this is a landmark. And today's news, just hot on the back of all of this, is that Netball Australia chair Marina Go has left the organisation. So
oh, wow. Okay.
Perhaps she was the mastermind of the sponsorship. That wasn't clear in the story that I read, but you can pretty much regard her as a scalp, I believe. So player power. And who said sport and politics don't mix? They always have. They always will. Be nice if they didn't have to. But when you start sponsoring a really terrific sport that is followed by a really wide audience like netball, and you know, even though Gina Rinehart has, of course, sponsored the Olympic team, so the Australian Olympic Committee has welcomed her sponsorship, but netball took a stand, and I salute them.
Yes, yeah, good for them, honestly. And I think that, you know, when we look at Australian sport as well, it's also inevitable that we have to talk about the climate change impact. And there are certain organizations and campaigns, like I know that the Pocock's lead organization called the Cool Down, which has basically amassed leaders in sport to talk about climate change, because ultimately, like, sport becomes unplayable at certain temperatures. Of course, sports people are going to want to talk about these things seriously and honestly. And to be fair as well, not consulting your players on what they have to wear, like, at all, regardless of what it's representing, a little bit off, I would say.
Indeed.
All right. Now let's talk about the Methane Pledge. The Albanese government.
I love methane pledges as much as you do. The methane pledge. But it deserves billing as the methane pledge, because methane's kind of the forgotten greenhouse gas, isn't it?
Yeah. So let's talk about what the Albanese government is doing. Ant, take the lead. What's happening here?
Well, the methane pledge was started by Joe Biden, and so America and the EU got together. They took it to COP26, and they just said, "Hey, look, let's try and reduce methane by 30% of 2020 levels by 2030. So by the end of this decade, let's have a third less methane emissions than we had at the start of this decade." Now, the Morrison government said, nah, not interested in signing at COP26. Albo and friends have now indicated interest in signing, haven't actually put pen to paper yet. But it's important. I mean, we know that methane, as I said, doesn't get the press that CO2 does. But it is a lot more powerful. I think it can heat the atmosphere up something like 80 times more than CO2 initially. It then, the effect stops quicker with methane. So there are good bits to methane and bad bits to methane. But, you know, it's caused a considerable amount of global warming so far. You've unearthed something here that says it's caused 0.5 degree of global heating, which is more than I would have thought, as opposed to the 0.8 caused by CO2. So good research by you, Alfie, chucking that in the notes, because we did know it was 1.3 degrees overall, but I didn't realize the methane component was that high. Anyway, long story short, we probably need to look at methane, much of which comes from agriculture as well as the coal and gas industries. Now, anytime you talk about getting rid of methane, the Nationals have a special kind of hissy fit. Barnaby Joyce a year or so ago said that, you know, the only way to get rid of methane would be to grab a rifle and go out and start shooting your cattle. Good on you, Barnaby. And this week, the Nationals have fired up in a similar way, but I don't want to give away everything in the interview. So long story short, methane, we need to cut it down. Does that mean we need to cut cattle down? Is it bye-bye burgers? Well, I thought I would speak to a beef farmer to find out the answer to that and other questions. So earlier this week, actually late last week, the Albanese government gave strong indications that it would sign up to the methane pledge, which means we're going to try and reduce Australia's methane emissions by around 30% of 2020 levels by the end of the decade. Some predictable noises came out of some predictable areas, you might say. The Nationals in particular kind of blew up, and just as they have done scare campaigns around things like they're going to take your ute and things like that in the past when electric cars were on the table, they have gone, now the Aussie barbecue is under threat. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese wants to take away the backyard barbecue. Well, that sounds a little bit extreme, so I thought we better get a beef farmer on the phone. Rob McCreath, you are that person, and we'll talk about your farm in a moment. But crucially, is the Aussie barbecue under threat?
Yeah, hi, Anthony. Well, I think that's a very small thing to worry about. I'm really worried about the end of rugby league. Not to mention AFL, it's all over. Life won't be worth living.
October is a difficult time for sports lovers, but these are difficult times for beef lovers, say the Nationals. Are they right?
No, they're not right. It's a big scare campaign. Climate change is caused by greenhouse gas emissions. Methane is an important greenhouse gas. So if we're going to do something about climate change, we've got to do something about methane. And climate change is a massive threat to agriculture. It already is impacting in a very strong way. Like just past few days, we've had massive floods here in Tasmania, record-breaking floods. Been bad through Victoria and New South Wales as well. So climate change is here and with us and having a big impact, and we've got to address it.
Yeah, well said, Rob. Well said. And, your property there, Shelduck Farm, in the Deloraine area of northern Tas, have you sort of been inundated, or have you managed to keep your head above water?
Well, a big chunk of the farm down on the creek flat was covered in water. I was amazed how big an area went under. Luckily, the water gets away quite quickly here, and we've had a little bit of damage to fences, but we've been relatively lucky. Some other neighbours have had a lot more damage than us, so sometimes you're lucky and sometimes you're not, but it's had a big impact on the area, and we've been cut off from the main road from town. It's been washed away, so all that sort of stuff's going on.
Well, there's so much going on, and we do appreciate your time on the Green Canary today. So let me ask this key question. We do know that emissions from cattle account for something like 11% of Australia's greenhouse emissions overall. They're a large component of our agricultural emissions. So what can farmers like you do? For example, I believe there are supplements and so on that you can add to the feed, but you tell me, what can farmers like yourself do who are running a herd of beef cattle to minimise those methane emissions?
Yeah, well, farmers are doing a lot of things already. It's not just, we better do something. You can certainly help things by being more efficient. And so it's the ruminants that give off methane, so that's cattle and sheep. And methane is produced in the rumen, which is one of the stomachs, by the bacteria. So you don't want to have too many passengers around. So like a beef cow that has a dead calf, well, don't keep her for another year doing nothing, because she's just emitting methane and not producing anything for you. So we need to get rid of those ones and bring in a new heifer instead. Be more efficient. We can grow pasture, productive long-term pasture with deep roots, and it's quite impressive how much carbon you can put in the soil. Like a degraded farm, very, very run down. If you plant productive pasture now, you can put a lot of carbon in the soil. So loads of people are getting into that. We're planting trees. Trees are great, of course. A lot of tree planting going on. We've planted about 1,200 in the past 2 years here, and in Tasmania the trees grow like rockets. There are other exciting things going on with feed additives. So there's a native seaweed called Asparagopsis that when you feed that to cattle, it can reduce the methane production by up to 90%. And there's 3 companies in Australia that are farming that Asparagopsis seaweed now. One of them is called Sea Forest. They're in Tasmania. And they're growing this seaweed on sea leases and also on land. And it's becoming it's going into commercial trials. There's also an artificial additive from Holland, which seems to work pretty well. They're using that in Brazil. So if we can just get the methane from cattle and sheep down, agriculture will be in a great place in relation to carbon emissions.
Right. So, it seems to me that in summary, there are loads of things that, as you say, not just that you can do, but that are already happening from responsible farmers. And you must, I guess, finally, you must get a little bit angry when the party that is supposed to represent people on the land like yourself just puts everything like this in the too hard basket.
Well, they claim to represent farmers, but I think they gave up on that a long time ago when they started getting donations from the gas companies. You just look at the political donations registered, look at all the names of all the gas companies that fund all the major parties, but the National Party. It's in the gas industry's interests for farmers to object to the Global Methane Pledge. They want us to be bunging on the turn about it because it gives them more cover. But methane from underground and bringing it up into the atmosphere, they've got a major problem. They're causing so much climate change. So, they really want us to be objecting where, you can just look at the influence of their political donations on the National Party. So the National Party gave up representing farmers a long time.
All right. Well, Rob McCreath, I really appreciate your time today. I wish you luck down there on Shelduck Farm, which I believe people can go and stay at and eat delicious produce from if you go down to Tasmania. So look out, might come your way one of these days. But for now, thanks very much for talking to the Green Canary.
No worries, Anthony.
All right. Thank you so much again for that interview, Ant. So that was Rob McCreath, who is a beef farmer from Tasmania. And I think that it is really important to start talking to farmers about these topics, especially because, they're going to cop a lot of the discussion around this methane pledge, right? I came across this statistic earlier this week that said that 50% of Australia's methane actually comes from the agriculture industry. So it's not surprising. But as he mentioned, we also have to talk about natural gas. Like, that is a huge issue. And do you remember a couple of weeks ago when that pipeline burst from Russia and they saw the biggest expulsion of methane from a natural gas pipeline in the ocean? It's absolutely wild. And, that is an industry that needs to be accountable for what it's releasing into the atmosphere.
Good point by you, and good point by Rob McCreath, who made that point as well. And thank you, Rob, for your time today. But as Rob said, and I actually learned so much in that interview, there are so many ways that farmers can cut down on methane, whether it's simple stuff, or planting trees, obviously, cuts down on their whole carbon equation, but feed that you can give to cattle, there are all sorts of things that they are doing and can do. And so they get so angry when they're misrepresented by the Nationals because, yes, it would be terrific if everybody went vegetarian and we didn't need cattle, but that is not realistically going to happen in the world. But fortunately, we do have solutions to that. Rob made that really clear. And I should just thank Farmers for Climate Action, which he's one of, and who provided that interview for us. They do great work. They have a bunch of farmers out there who are really articulate and who actually are at the coalface, which is a terrible analogy to use, but they are.
The cow face.
The cow face of this issue. So thanks, Farmers for Climate Action and Rob McCreath.
All right, brilliant. Now let's talk about mulch. These are the little curiosity stories that Ant and I bring each other at the end of each week. Ant, a Living Planet report. Go for it.
It's more than a curiosity. It's like depression.
Yeah, this is actually genuinely really upsetting. I'm sorry in advance.
Yeah, look, WWF Australia, the World Wildlife Fund, they've just published a little report, the Living Planet report, that it should probably be called the Dying Planet report. We do try to be optimists here at the Green Canary, but this ain't good. Between 1970 and 2018, so that's 48 years, global wildlife populations fell by an average of, drumroll, 69%. 69%. And, they actually observed 32,000 species. So they've done a fair old sample, haven't they, Alfie?
Yeah, it is pretty shocking. There are some even more shocking statistics, like populations of sharks and rays specifically have dropped by 71% worldwide over the past 50 years. They're saying that land use is still the biggest current threat to nature, but climate change is very quickly about to overtake that. And WWF are stressing that there needs to be an urgent response to the loss of biodiversity. But they're also stressing that it can be turned around. So as much as this might be appalling news, I think that it is just yet another alarm bell.
Now, we're about to get onto a really interesting biodiversity topic, which we flagged at the top of the pod today. But before we get there, second little mulchy, David Pocock again. Yes, you cannot shut the ACT senator up. Neither should you. He says good things and he does good things. He's spoken out this week about the amount of agricultural chemicals and pesticides that are used to produce our food. Now, he doesn't have a concrete policy strategy. I don't mind when a politician does this selfie, when they just start the convo. Seems to me that's what he's done this week. He's particularly, upset about glyphosate, which is the active ingredient in Roundup, which is a popular weed killer. What have you heard about this topic lately?
So is it actually pronounced glyphosate? Glyphosate, right? No? I've never said it out loud, but let's just assume. Anyway, I read a study about that this week. It is that active ingredient in Roundup. And this study said that even just a small dose of this stuff can actually strongly affect a bee's ability to navigate around the place, because it reduces both their vision and memory. And then that can impact their ability to actually forage for food and then go back to their hive. And I listened to a fantastic Guardian podcast this week that was actually following on from their investigation into blueberry farming on the New South Wales North Coast, which we spoke about on the pod a couple of weeks ago. And basically, this journalist was talking about how Australia's standards for pesticides seem to be so much lower than everywhere else in the world. There are things that we're using in our pesticides that have been outright banned in most other countries. It's pretty shocking when you listen to it. But again, Pocock has basically just said that he would like to see things like landholders being rewarded for improving the natural habitat, much like we were talking about in the cattle section back there. And he's also urged that the federal government needs to direct more money towards conservation to fill that gap between what they're currently offering to try and conserve species and that $1 billion that researchers are saying is actually needed to save species. So again, he's doing great work. He's using his platform and he's speaking about issues that I think are going to be coming up more and more in the months to come.
Yeah, that's well said. And I'd just like to say that glyphosate. Look, this is actually a fact. This is a rule. You may not know this, but when a scientific word passes 10 letters or longer, you can pronounce it however the hell you like.
Is that what they say? Is that in the rule book?
Yeah, that's actually a rule. Yeah.
Fuck it. Go for it. All right. And just another biodiversity story to round things out. We're going to be talking about lawns. And I found a new meta-analysis on the internet this week that found that manicured lawns are one of the biggest factors affecting insect decline in urban environments. So not only do lawns tend to lower the abundance of native insect species, they actually make a better home for pest species. So these researchers are basically saying a reduction in mowing frequency benefits insect biodiversity. And this is something I have been thinking about so much this week. I was telling you before the pod, I have just been thinking about lawns for a good couple of days now. Like the amount of lawns that houses are just sitting on, that people just have sitting there. And like you said, they're completely barren environment.
Barren is the word. I mean, look, I mowed my lawn on the weekend, so guilty as charged here, but it's only a little lawn. I mean, I think the greatest waste of space in urban Australia and anywhere in the world is the nature strip, as we call it.
Yes.
That ridiculous bit of lawn between the footpath and the road. It should be veggie patches. It should be long native grasses. It should be shrubs that flower, that birds can eat on. Every nature strip in Australia should be turned into something terrific. And, and then you could say, all right, people, have a bit of back lawn, but they are barren environments. And it's just fascinating to see, as you put it, the meta-analysis that has proven that manicured lawns are one of the biggest factors affecting insect decline. You're going to absolutely convince me to replant my back lawn now and my nature strip.
Yeah, look, chuck some wildflower seeds in there. There's even been a push in the UK recently for people to just give up mowing their grass for a
Wow.
good couple of months every year, because it does make this very significant impact on the amount of insects that are able to hang out there. Insects, you know, you get birds, it starts to flourish really quickly. And, you know, I'm never going to be a person who can necessarily afford to have a lawn, probably being somebody in their late 20s living in Sydney. But I would like to be able to recommend to others who may be sitting on them that you can have creative use of these spaces.
That's very well said. And, you know, the sound of summer in the suburbs is to some extent the sound of lawnmowers buzzing on a Saturday morning. But wouldn't it be wonderful if it was the sound of bees buzzing on a Saturday morning?
Yeah, absolutely. Very well put, Ant. All right. Well, that's enough of us buzzing for this week. I reckon that is all we have time for on the pod. Thank you so much for joining us. So just before we head off, as always, we would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we're recording, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. We'd like to pay our respect to elders past and present and acknowledge that this land was stolen, never ceded.
Thank you, Alfie. And I'd just like to remind people, as ever, to subscribe to our newsletter, which delivers your weekly green news in one friendly, accessible, informative, analytical hit. It's all there. Oh, Alfie, if only there'd been something like that when you and I were growing up, we would have known so much more than we already know. And perhaps some of the listeners would say that'd be useful. But anyway, hello at thegreencanary.co is how you subscribe to that newsletter. We're also on social. We are at Green Canary Pod on Twitter. We are at Green Canary Media on Instagram. And we are at your eardrums next week on the Green Canary podcast.
Nice one. All right. We'll see you then. Bye.
Bye.